lots of the things we were doing, people thought were magic. I mean, they just didn't understand. And that's one of the biggest advantage I had was I didn't have a background in banking. I didn't know you couldn't do these things. It just seemed apparent to me that why wouldn't you do these things? And so you need a mix of people in your groups and your teams of people that don't know, because the people that know what we know up until now. They can't see those incremental changes.
The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Typhon. Typhon is the creator of Infinia, a dramatically better digital banking platform for community financial institutions, as well as several platform-agnostic, revenue-generating point solutions. Our highly configurable platform and broad ecosystem of third-party partners ensure our entire suite is scalable and extensible to meet the needs of any FI. On our podcast, you will hear host Josh DeTar discuss today's most pressing financial technology topics with seasoned industry experts from every possible discipline.
You know, your podcast hasn't officially made it until there's ads in it. But this is one you're not going to want to skip past. And, well, if you do, feel free to hit that fast forward 15 seconds button twice. Ever wonder what gives me my energy and enthusiasm during these podcasts? You know, outside of my relentless desire to learn about, connect, share, and build up community FIs and their mission to support the communities they serve? It's coffee, and lots of it. Now, you want to know what's better than your regular old coffee? How about donating $5 to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals through Credit Unions for Kids every time you purchase high-quality, ethically sourced coffee that also provides living wages to coffee farmers? So if you want to listen to this episode with epic levels of caffeine-induced focus and help kids in need, head to javaforkids.org to learn more and buy a bag or 10. Thanks.
Welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. My guest today is Mac Thompson, the founder and CEO for White Clay. I love my life. Do I love every day of it? No, but I love the pursuit. You know, those words stuck out at me when Mac was describing himself. One day, I would love to have a giant bonfire to make s'mores and sing Kumbaya around and invite all my podcast guests to it. You see, they all have one thing in common, a desire to make the world a better place. And you know, Mac might just be one of the people at the center of that bonfire. It's been so evident in talking to him that at his core, he believes in taking on challenges with a singular focus of improving people's lives. As a punk rock surfer kid from Kentucky, I know that sounds like an oxymoron, don't worry, there's a story behind it. Mac was an introvert. In high school, he actually made a concerted effort to play the role of an extrovert, though, and it helped shape much of who he has become today in terms of his involvement in the arts and the community. As with many of us in the industry, Mac has a story about getting into banking that does not start with, I want to get into banking. But here we are. After being told by a bank, you know, you're not really that good of an accountant. What else can you do? He took his tech nerdy skills to work in process automation for that bank. And the deeper he dove into the banking world, the more he realized that solving problems in banking could have tremendous impact on people and ultimately would fill his soul in being able to have a meaningful impact. Mac said, quote, I believe in the financial services industry. So whether it's being involved in community sports or arts or staying up late at night trying to solve problems for community FIs, Mac is always trying to answer the biggest question of the day, which is, how can I help someone today? We've got lots to dive into today, from data and AI to the massive market opportunity of commercial banking services for SMBs via community FIs. So like Mac says, let's enjoy the pursuit and let's get started. Mac, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. We're going to have some fun.
You know, I love when, we kind of started talking beforehand. You were like, I mean, there's going to be no shortage of words. I do love to talk. And when you get me rolling about banking, like, whew.
I do.
So, for starters, we got to address kind of the elephant in the room of, how does this Kentucky punk rock kid also be a surfer? I was joking with Mac and I was like, when I was writing that up, I was like, I had to admit, I actually had to do a quick like Google Map search. I was like, wait, there's no water around Kentucky, right? Or am I crazy? So tell me about that, man.
Growing up, we lived in Western Kentucky on land between the lakes area and Lake Barkley. So middle of nowhere, near Paducah. You can describe it. That's like an hour away. That was the nearest movie theater. But we had a house also in Vero Beach, Florida, so I spent school years or school months, days, or whatever in rural Kentucky, and then we spent summers, vacations, and everything else in Florida. So Sebastian Inlet, just north of Vero, is where the surfing took place. Some in Vero, but Sebastian Inlet was a lot better. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I
how
was like, I don't know.
the two
You did like surf in the barley fields or what? Like how does Kentucky and surfing line up?
You don't surf in the Ohio River. That would not be good.
But so I also think it was kind of an interesting story of just kind of how you got into banking. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, early 90s recession. My parents had moved full time to Florida. I was leaving school. They gave me a little bit of time to try to get a job because my girlfriend, who's now my wife forever, and she's going to be upset and remember the years, and she was still in school. So I wanted to stay in Kentucky and stay with her. And so I went to go look for a job. Applied to a lot of places. Didn't get any of the other places. Ended up in an unemployment line, which is a transformational experience if you ever experience it. And one of the opportunities they presented me with was to be an accountant at one of the, was a regional bank. Now it's not around anymore. And after a while, that's where I started. I had no intention of going into banking. I was an accounting English major. Banking was not on the top 10. But I needed a job and I wanted to stay, so got into banking.
Well, I think what's interesting about that story as we were talking about it, right, is, one of the topics that I really want to talk to you about today is just kind of the transformation that has happened in this industry. And what's interesting about banking is there has been a significant transformation in banking. I would argue there's even been bigger transformation outside of banking. And so how do those two things kind of reconcile? And really the big obvious one, right, is just kind of the pace of innovation of technology versus the pace of innovation in banking. And for good reason, right? I mean, there's certain elements of banking that aren't going to evolve or innovate and don't need to or shouldn't, right? I mean, a checking account is a checking account is a checking account kind of thing. I mean, we don't need to necessarily have a radical evolution of something like that, although I'm totally open for debate on that. But you know what I mean? It's not like the evolution of a computer turning into an iPhone and access to the internet and those kinds of things. But those two worlds are kind of colliding. And that was kind of your first introduction into banking, right? Yeah. So you were telling me that, I mean, you started as this accountant doing very manual paper processes. And when they politely told you, you kind of stink at accounting, they're like, what else can you do? And you're like, well, all this paper I've been dealing with, I think I could actually automate it. That's kind of a cool story.
Yeah, so I started using computers when I was late 70s, right? So, I mean, I don't know, 6, 7, or probably 8, 9 years, in that range somewhere. I started doing computers around that. But when I showed up for work in 1992, they handed me a bunch of green ledger books, a bunch of pencils, a eraser, and one of those calculators, a big roll in the end of it. No computer in my cubicle, and that's how I was supposed to do everything. And I have no idea what these things are. And no, there was one computer on the floor in the building at the time, and that's where we were starting. They had an AS400 mini mainframe on in the data center in the building next door. Everything was basically green bar paper that got printed out every morning, and that's when I got into banking, that's how everything was manual. Everything was. Some people were using Excel. Not Excel at the time, Lotus 123 at the time. And it was just a different way of thinking. I mean, it'd be completely foreign to people working in an office now. And if you thought that in just 10 years, within 3 to 5 years, we were using databases, integrating data, pulling out extracts, starting to build things that would transform into warehouses. It just was a radical acceleration. And then internet came. And then all of a sudden, the acceleration even went further and faster in lots of different ways. Mm-hmm. It was a really transformational. I mean, within a year of me being there, we all had computers, Very few people knew how to use them. It was just amazing. Yeah.
But so I think it'd be good to talk about. So you're kind of like, all right, so I'm not going to do accounting, but I'm going to automate this.
Oh, yeah.
And so what does that process look like? And I just think it was kind of a cool story of talking about
I will tell
how
you
you
that.
like map this whole thing out, right?
So about a year and a half in, I got the red and the black tickets because I used to do all the punch all the tickets in accounting. That's what my job was, which was not a great job. And I got them backwards all the time. And I also did all the intercompany accounting entries, which those are big entries. I got those backwards. So the people in finance, the upper ups, I drove them insane. So they were going to get rid of me a year and a half, 2 years in, something like that. And they said, we think you're smart. Can you just tell us something that you can do a job that would, more than pay for your salary and why you'd be here? And what I said was, well, you guys, it turns out there's about 9 million pages a month of green bar prints coming out of the mainframe. And I was like, I don't think you need all that paper. I don't know how much it is, but we'll find out. But I think I can reduce that significantly. And it costs about 10.5 cents a page. So I didn't know anything about banking. I didn't even take a class in banking. So what I did was I showed up at 3 o'clock in the morning where they filled the carts up. The carts distributed all this paper throughout the organization. They just put giant stacks of it. And I mapped it. And I went through it. I mapped out, these are all the reports. This is what was in them. This is what the size was. And mapped how that all went through the entire organization, out to the branches, call centers, everywhere. And I went through and basically cut 2/3 of that out. And in the process of doing that, I also figured out what was in and on all those reports and began understanding how loans, deposits, wealth, all this data, and it's really data, was going throughout the bank. And because of a computer background, we began, after we had reduced the paper, I actually began building data environments around these things because I had the tech skills, but also then had understood what was all these data elements going around the bank. And that's how we got into it. And from there, we just went from one problem to the other, finding opportunities, using information to make the bank run better and take care of the customers.
And the reason I like that story is I think it kind of leads into one of the big topics that you and I wanted to talk about, which is just almost the idea of how innovation happens, right? And, Mac and I were kind of talking about this before we started recording. Like, if you just bury your head in the sand and then you poke it back up 5 years from now, you're going to go, oh my gosh, like this cataclysmic event has happened and so much has evolved. But in all reality, like, it's been evolving throughout. And so, we kind of use the blatant example of, I talked to a lot of folks that are like, ChatGPT kind of came out of nowhere. We're like, no, not really. Actually, it's been there for a long time. And we've been using this stuff for a long time. It just kind of hit your radar now, right? And so especially in an industry like banking, where a lot of times we get hyper-focused on kind of what's happening in our core business, if we're not pulling our head out of the sand and looking around, yeah, you are going to wake up and go, hey, I selected whatever it may be, a core, a digital banking, a data approach, an AI tool in this moment in time, and I signed a 5-year contract. And at the end of that 5-year contract, you're coming up and you're like, oh my gosh, the whole world has changed. Yeah. But it needs to be an iterative process throughout, right? And so that was kind of what you were a part of, was looking at, okay, how do we look for problems to make sure that we're not just waking up one day and there's been a revolution and we weren't a part of it?
And lots of the things we were doing, people thought were magic. I mean, they just didn't understand. And that's one of the biggest advantage I had was I didn't have a background in banking. I didn't know you couldn't do these things. It just seemed apparent to me that why wouldn't you do these things? And so you need a mix of people in your groups and your teams of people that don't know, because the people that know what we know up until now. They can't see those incremental changes. That's why diversities of perspectives, thoughts, backgrounds are so important, because they can bring, an accounting English major you wouldn't think would be able to redesign information flow in a bank, right? Doesn't come up with something that would be a natural evolution.
That wasn't on your resume.
That's not what I was trying to do. I was just trying to be able to pay the bills. But that change and the possibility of those changes is what is going to be so exciting about now, because we just have a confluence of so many things going on that AI, early days, early innings in AI. And let me rephrase that. The perception of the public and of the mass of people, it's early innings. For people who've been working in this space, we've been doing all kinds of AI technologies for a while.
Yeah.
It's just reaching a critical mass, and it's getting to the point where it's going to, the internet, lots of people used the internet before the 90s, just no one knew that's what it was going to turn into. But now so we have these things coming in. We also just have an explosion of how we're going to use these things. We were talking about AI on a panel, and one of the things is we'll first start trying to pave cow paths. These are the ways we used to do it. Now we're going to use AI to automate that. That's great. The real transformation is going to come is when we completely redefine our business models and how we even our paradigm around what's going on to create things that we can't even understand exist now. The internet started, we had pets.com, right? Let me build an online thing that's going to sell pet supplies online, right? It's not that transformational. We were essentially doing what we were doing before, but we're going to do it online. Better one might be music. So you had Napster, right? Napster was really transformational because it took this product that you could only really pick and use. You could either rip it off the radio, or you could go to a record store, CD store, music store, whatever you want to call it, and then shuffle through all this stuff and buy things. Napster came along, all of a sudden we started sharing stuff. Didn't have a business model, but tech-wise, it's kind of interesting because music files are small. You could get away with it on a 26, 56K modem. Apple starts coming along and they figure out a way to make that legal. Essentially, that was the real transformation of iTunes. It wasn't technology-wise. I actually thought Napster was better, personally. But iTunes allowed you to buy it legally and had a legal process for it. But then they missed the next step. The next step was, I don't want to have to manage all 100,000 songs in my library. I need someone to go do that for me because it takes too much effort. Then you get into Spotify, and you get into this musical. So most people now are actually listening to music in a way that would be unimaginable to someone 20 years ago. And you can get any piece of music you want in the world pretty much instantaneously. And at the same time, have the intelligence around that let you say, if you like this and this and this, you should really listen to this. In our way to experience and explore this world of music is, would you ever want to go back? You wouldn't. And I think in banking, we're getting close to one of those types of evolutions. I don't know how fast it's going to come. We sometimes are reticent to move quickly in banking, but we're getting the components of what that is. Yeah.
That's a good analogy. It is one of the things we talk about a lot on the podcast is banking is a very interesting industry in terms of innovation and disruption, from the sense that, I don't know if music may be a good example to still use, and just bear with my word vomit thought process here. But, right, if we transform, the music industry and all of a sudden, kill somebody's, Spotify list, it sucks. They're probably going to be pretty pissed, but it's not catastrophic, right? If we crash the banking infrastructure, it's pretty catastrophic. So for good reason, we're also cautious about the innovation leaps that we take and the things that we do and the risks that we take. And then, oh, by the way, let's layer that whole compliance conversation on top of this, right? And so I think there is, some elements both inside and outside of our control in terms of how this evolves and innovates. But the reason I like that you use, music as an example, right? I think one of the things that I've been really interested about, and I'd love to get your take on, is anytime kind of the next buzzword comes around is how do people latch onto it? And I think you might agree with me, AI is the buzzword of the day right now. I keep making the joke that if you want to sell more products, just change your name from, name to name.ai and you're good to go.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody keeps asking, what are you doing in AI? And it's well, what's the use case, right? And so find a use case. And then to your point, it almost seems revolutionary a lot of times in the banking industry. But yeah, you've actually been using this for a long time with just things like Spotify helping curate your music list.
Oh, yeah. Alexa, right? Siri, Alexa's using voice voice to basically text AI technologies. AI is almost like this whole suitcase filled with 20 to 30 different kinds of technology. And some of these have been around for a long time. The fraud AI models, most banks have been using this for a while.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about this, ChatGPT is changing the way people experience it. So you're changing, not the technology is changing, but what's most felt is this seems completely different. I perceive it differently. It's the non-logical kind of experiential piece of the outputs of this that are radically changing people's perception of what you can use this stuff for. That part I think is exciting. I'm really excited when we figure out how to use it to solve problems that we haven't thought of, that solve problems we thought were unsolvable. And that's going to be exciting. We don't even have the question. Honestly, if you talk about AI today, it's very different than we talked about it 3 months ago. That's how quick this stuff's moving.
Yeah.
I mean, we are just moving at a pace. We were talking to some banks, and they were talking about their AI strategy, and they're going to put a team together, and they're going to work on it for about a year, and they're going to write their AI strategy. And I'm like, I wouldn't burn the time. What you need is a framework. You need a group of people who are constantly in the know on this, constantly learning, and especially community bank, small regional space. This other thing, for your bank, define what AI means. AI, one person's talking about AI, they're talking about large language models and ChatGPT and all that. Another one's talking about AI, and they're really talking about machine learning, fraud identification models. And they're both AI. They're just really different ways of using it and technologies. But internally, define what you want your bank to use these terms, because they're all over the place. People are using it. So that's inside your bank, put together a 2 to 3 page document of how your bank thinks about AI and the language we're going to use. I think it would help conversations, because I see people talking past each other constantly.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating because, instead of a constructive conflict, people think that they're in conflict, and they're really not in conflict. They're just talking about different things. But it's exciting.
That's a good way to think about it, Mac. I always try to bring it back to some simple analogy that my little pea brain can understand. And, I've talked about in previous podcasts, how AI is just a tool. So, if you're a hammer, you need a nail, right? But, as you were talking about it, and it's one person could be saying AI and be talking about, yes, ChatGPT, LLM models. The other side could be talking about, more ML type of stuff. It's like saying, we're talking about transportation. It's okay, well, are we talking about bicycles, spaceships, boats, submarines? What are we talking about? There's a lot of use cases. And it just got me thinking, because I'm looking at the picture of the beautiful blue water behind you in your office. And I'm like, if somebody is saying, yeah, we're talking about transportation, and what they're really talking about is a bicycle, that's only going to work so far in your picture, right? Yeah. As soon as I get to the edge of that dock, it's utterly useless to me. So how are you actually defining use cases and then building a strategy around that? And then to the same point, it's this stuff is evolving so insanely fast that, we were talking about earlier, it's if you look at even just technology of the past, right? And you buried your head in the sand for a year and you woke up and you were like, oh my goodness, so much has changed. Nowadays, it's you bury your head in the sand for a week and you come back up for air and you're like, oh my goodness, so much has changed.
Yeah. I mean, the example on COVID example with DocuSign. I don't know if you remember all that. I'm not pushing a product. It was just a great example because PPP program and everything, all this hit. DocuSign probably in their business, I don't know if they did. I don't even want to DocuSign. They probably had a 3-year journey about their implementation rate of what they were trying to do. Because of PPP and COVID at the same time, they implemented most of the U.S. market within about a month. We went from being able to very few people digitally signing documents to pretty much every business could do it, because you had to do it to get the PPP program in place.
Yeah.
And that if you express that to someone in January of 2020, that pretty much every business in the United States would be able to digitally sign all the loan documents required for a federal program, they would have said, that's impossible. That's just never, ever going to happen. Yeah, we did. And we did it. It wasn't exactly pretty all the time. And there's lots of, other technologies are out there. But it was one of those things where we can change that fast if we have to. And if we have the desire, and I think that's why there's going to be some, if you were to describe someone in 1970, you can transact instantaneously around the world, fraud-free for the most part. Yeah, ACH card, pick your payments channel, right? There's all kinds of ways to do this. But, instantaneously is relative, so card transactions are pretty much, you can go pretty much in the world and use a credit card.
Yeah.
You can, in the United States, feel very secure, other than some most recent, that your deposits at a federally FDIC insured bank are going to be safe. That just the whole current banking experience of access to things, there's lots of areas of improvement. I'm not saying we're perfect, but if you compare that person in 1970 to now, they'd say you're in a science fiction movie. Because it didn't exist. I mean, you were writing checks. If you wanted to pay someone over there, you'd put it in the mail, and you hope it got there, and it probably would, just when. And if you wanted to pay someone in London, you had to go figure out some way to do international mail, which was probably going to your main post. It's just these things, and the ability of our ability to interact with the information and transact with the information is incredible. And those rails, one of the things the banking industry is, those underlying rails are so powerful. It's really an inhibitor, that and compliance. They're both awesome, but they're inhibitors to this change because they work so well. I mean, our cost per transaction, some of the stuff is tiny. But there's going to be a way that someone rethinks what transacting means. I don't know what that is. I wish I did. If I did, I would probably tell you to go build it and sell it. Sorry. But there's the possibility, it's like redundancy. We have redundancy now because we're using essentially mainframes and clouds. They're not mainframes, but at the same time, very large, centralized, huge processing connected through the internet, and that's what we're doing. But some of the other technologies are more distributed, and distributed meaning they can be redundant, and that means there's more. If a hurricane takes out your data center, all of it exists somewhere else, or it's distributed. There's no central. There's going to be I think we've been going through. You went mainframe, and you went clients, and then we're going through the centralized, decentralized of data. And I think at some point we're going to some radical different version of decentralized that probably uses some variation or evolution of a blockchain something. I don't think it's there yet because blockchain is usually bi-party, and I think what we're going to is at least tri-party because you need, with the regulatory environment, those ledgers need to have a regulatory party a part of it so they can enforce. But I don't know what it is. But point being is, I think 20 years, if you were to, I don't know, it's 20, maybe it's 10. Someone pops their head up, we'll be transacting in a really different way fundamentally than we are now. Because essentially, there's other things we do, but we're pushing zeros and ones. And that's part of our value proposition. It's not all of it, but a lot of the infrastructure of what we do is zeros and ones. I'm looking forward to how it's going to be awesome.
You made kind of two interesting comments in there. One is that, you think about how little the banking industry has changed over the last 50 years, but also how much it has changed. And I think, a great example is money movement, right? And just the thought process of transferring funds to somebody internationally 50 years ago versus today. And just the options, the speed, the cost, et cetera. Yeah. But I think the other thing that you made the comment on that I found pretty interesting is that, like the DocuSign example, right? Like if you had told somebody in January that we could do this, they'd have said you're crazy. And I think a lot of times technology is actually a lot further ahead and more capable than we really realize, right? And I think it moves a lot faster than we realize as well. I had to pull up the data while you were talking because I didn't want to get it wrong. But our CEO, Siva, is a former Intel guy, and he's a total data junkie. And one of the things that he was talking about to me recently, and he sent me some of this data on, that's what I was pulling up, is just the speed at which innovation happens in technology is kind of governed by three major laws: Moore's law, Nielsen's law, and Huang's law. So Moore's law is really talking about the computational power of computers and how it exponentially compounds, right? And he actually gave me a really good example of this just recently in that, you kind of think about it like the compounding of money, right? Yeah. So for a banker, it's a really easy concept to understand how, the compounding of technology increases its speed, just like the compounding of money increases your overall assets, right? And if you look at your bank account balance on day one versus 10 years from now, and you just kind of wake up and look at it 10 years from now, you'd be like, oh my gosh, how did it get here? And it's that compounding effect. But if you looked at it throughout the process, like you'd see that compounding effect. So Moore's law essentially states that over a 10-year period, computing power is going to get 30x faster, right? And then Huang's law is talking about really the next generation of supercomputers. And in a 10-year period, a specialized kind of AI-driven supercomputer will actually get 100 times faster. Yep. And then network speeds over that same period go up by about 60x, right? So we're talking like massive increases to compute power and ability to process things and ability to transmit that data over that 10-year period. And so you think about just the implications of how those laws on the systems that we use to operate our industry, like that's real impact.
That's huge. I mean, the other piece, so we're talking about how you can process the zeros and ones and there's interactivity. There's also the power of the power of networks, meaning how many people are in a network, and I'm using network in a really high level way. So if you have 1,000 people in a network, what you can learn from that is one thing. If you have 10,000, 100,000, 10 billion, there's a logarithmic effect of knowledge and understanding that comes from, and it's being enabled by the things you just mentioned, but it's how those things are interacting together and how we're able to use them that is just going to change our entire paradigm. I use that word a decent amount, sorry, but how we're thinking about what this stuff means. Because we're going to understand behaviorally things we're doing, because it will tell us. Because we're creatures of habit, generally speaking. We do the same things, and it's going to be an interesting learning opportunity to figure out how we leverage that to make things better. Our ability to process information on a computer level is outpacing our level to understand it at a human level. And that is going to be probably one of the challenges someone's going to help figure out. How do you take all of this possibility and then make it something that's useful every day? And I actually think that's one of the powers of ChatGPT was. It felt like something human. It wasn't, but it felt like this could write a letter or write a nighttime story for my child. Right? It was all of a sudden this abstract mathematical craziness that turned into this crazy story you can spend 5 minutes with your kid with. And that experiential piece of this, I think, is, like at a bank, we were talking about that a little bit earlier. Actually, the more interesting question for community banks isn't how you build your own AI capabilities. It's figuring out how you would want to use them to help your clients and help your shareholders. Because you're not, as a community bank, you're not going to have the capability. You can do some things, and you might be the 1 in a million, whatever. But more than likely, a vendor somewhere, a partner somewhere, is going to be creating these technologies. What the partner can't tell you what to do is how do you use that to take your bank, deliver to your community, and take care of them and your shareholder. And spending more time on figuring that out is actually a much more interesting question, I think, to community banks than trying to figure out how they're going to build their own large language model inside their firewalls. Please don't do that. I'm just saying.
There's tools for that. There's people with way bigger budgets for that.
Yeah. I mean, the armies at some of the large ones, and that's what they're doing. But that will come down. Those will be available. And, people get lost in technology, but it's really how you use that technology to achieve what you want that's actually the harder question. And the ones that figure that out first they're going to lead. So that's just my belief in that. I think they should spend more time figuring out what they would want to do with some of these things than what these things could do for you. So
that's a good point. I mean, it's like, you could have Gordon Ramsay's kitchen, but if you don't know what you're going to cook, you got all the tools, but how are you going to use them?
I can still make pancakes. Pancakes are good.
Pancakes. I do love me some pancakes. Now I want pancakes. Why'd you have to do that?
I don't like pancakes. I haven't had pancakes in a while, but they're really good.
I think that is the important...
but that's actually the exciting part about some of this is you don't have to be a super nerdy tech guy to begin thinking about how you might choose to use these tools. And I think how they're going to use them is probably equally exciting to me as it is the technology piece of, I remember how you originally built hard drive, like how hard drives were built when they first started. I have a 100 meg hard drive or 5 meg hard drive. Isn't this crazy? There's a physical spinning wheel, and you could actually understand it because it was simple enough at the time. And you look at that and go, now you can put terabytes on little drive. It's just crazy, but you can. But we also need to think about the efficiency of how we use all this. It's one of the things that just me personally, I'm like, we used to write code to handle massive data sets on things that had very little computational power, very little memory, and very little hard drive space. And now we're talking about thousands of terabytes and just enormous power. And are we using this all super efficiently? I know I'm off on a tangent, but it's one of those interesting things.
What do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by are we using it
How
efficiently?
big was Excel in 1996, right? Probably 35 meg. The software program, Excel,
Yeah.
35 meg. The one now is gigs, right? In terms of software size.
Yeah.
How functionally different is that really for what 95% of people use?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're running around. I'm just looking at my desktop has 64 gig of RAM, probably some processor that would have been able to run, the entire world 40 years ago, and terabytes and terabytes or whatever. And it's just one of those things when I think about. This is me because I think about these things and I do. Energy consumption. What we're using this stuff for? Could we run computers with? Could we write software that's much more efficient about how we use these things? It's just different ways. But right now we don't. We just faster, bigger, bigger, bigger. But at some point we have an opportunity to optimize. I'm off on a tangent on that. So we can break.
It's so funny, Mac. I don't even know why. I don't actually follow a lot of like tech stuff in like social media, but for whatever reason, I saw this meme literally last night flying home, and now I wish I had saved it because it would have been so perfect for this conversation. But it was like, and I'm gonna get the numbers wrong because I'm not a computer technical person, so bear with me. But it was like, 5 megabytes of RAM. What did you do with me in 1970? We landed on the moon.
Yeah.
300 terabytes of it today. And my computer is running slow. Why? Because Excel has an extra tab open.
Yeah. We're doing a TikTok video.
Yeah.
So,
And you're like, wait, yeah, we landed on the moon with less. And my computer's over here like smoking out the side because I opened Excel. Wait, what? Like, we missed something. So,
but exciting times. And constantly learning and evolving. That's the key to the whole thing. But community banks, this comes up a lot around. Think about how you would want to use this to to help your customers, help your shareholders.
yeah.
And because I've had board members, we have this problem. We'll just get AI to solve that. I'm like, you don't even know how many clients you have. Yet you're going to use AI to solve this complicated problem. That's not how that works.
Yeah.
But on the positive note, it will help. We just don't know how yet.
Yeah, it does. I hate to be a broken record on this, but it always comes back down to use cases.
Yeah.
Right. And you can have a rocket, but if you don't have a use case to go to the moon, it's kind of useless. So, one of the things you were talking about earlier, Mac, was just how even going back to your first job at the bank, like you had a tremendous amount of data on your customers. Mm-hmm. It was just an unusable format, right? And so you kind of put it into usable formats, so you start to learn. But like even in 2024, I think there's a massive amount of data that we're just not truly even scratching the surface of leveraging and understanding to kind of even look at simple things like transactional behavior. Like you're saying, we're creatures of habit, right? And so how can we start to create some use cases and strategies around just better understanding our customers, our members, our users, their engagement, and how to create deeper, more meaningful engagement with them?
How to do it? Some people have been doing it for a while, usually on the bigger side of the equation. The first step is you actually, this is so funny, it's not technology, is do you want to know? as a bank or credit union? Do you want to figure this out? Or do you just want to keep doing, answering the phone, taking care of whoever walks in the door, taking care of whatever comes through the website or the, technology? Because you can today, if you were a bank, be able to understand, do a behavioral segmentation on your customers, figure out who they are, how they're getting value from you, what they like, what they don't like, what they're interested in, and how you can optimize the experience for them. And they're not all the same. Some people like digital channels. Some people like this. Well, I will tell you one thing that's interesting. I don't know if anyone is all of one. It's not homogenous populations, right?
Yeah.
The people have like varied things, and the ability to understand the transaction. I'll say this: if you have their operating account, you can really understand the client because you can take that data and do all kinds of powerful stuff with it. There's a lot of tricks in doing that. I won't get into all that because I'm not here to sell anything, but it's understanding them. I'll give you an example. If you wanted to understand attrition, your client in your transaction data will tell you when they're attriting 6 to 12 months before your account is closed.
Mm-hmm.
There's exceptions to that, usually event-driven, like someone gets very angry at the bank for something, like an error or some perceived error or something. But all that behavior is in that transaction. That transaction data tells you everything. They tell you if you have the operating account, who else they're banking with, what kinds of interactions they do, the pace of how they're using cash relative to their balance sheet. There's just so much information in there. But the real problem with most banks is that they don't even want to necessarily know. They're worried about they're managing their bank off of I'm a ex-finance, but I was in finance for a long time. They're running their bank off of their financial statements. And you have to do that. We're publicly traded entities for the most part. Some of them are private, some of them are credit unions, right? But you still have to, you have governance and everything you need to run it. It makes sense. But you also have to run your bank off of your customers and your members. And you have to understand them really well and make sure that you're delivering what they're wanting, not necessarily what you want for them, but what they need to do to be successful in their life. And it's a really different way of thinking about how you optimize those relationships. The data's there. It is hard and it's challenging at points, but there's technologies out there from a number of vendors that help you go figure these things out. The first step in that, though, is wanting to be able to say, you know what, I want to run my financial statement, make my financial statements, but I'm also going to seek to understand who my customers are, why they're with us, how I can go help them do what they need to do. A super challenge. This one time I'm probably on a slight tangent here. One of the things I've been trying this for about 15 years is how do you help customers do a better job of financially managing for themselves? How do you help them, financial literacy coupled by improved financial behavior? The struggle I've always had is the data and technology. I've tried this in a bunch of different places. They don't necessarily want our help the way that we're trying to help them. There must be a better way to be able to help them in a way that they want to be helped. And I don't know what that is. I wish I did. Because I can do things where I can lay out, hey, you're spending too much money or you're whatever. But the problem is then they feel like is a banker type. And they all think very differently than banker types. That's one of the funniest things in a room full of bankers. Your customers do not think anything like you. You're rational, you're whatever. But if you get a focus group of people that spend $5,000 a year in overdraft fees, and they pay them, you get in that room, they don't want to talk about overdraft. They don't care because they see that. I'm not saying people on the low end of the economic, because if you're on the low end of the economic, you can't afford them. You're in a different group, and that's a different problem. I'm talking about very affluent people who overdraft like mad because they have a lifestyle they want to live, and the cost of living that lifestyle is I spend $5,000 a year in overdraft fees. If you call me about it, you're just going to piss me off. I don't know if the language is good, might be beeped. If you talk to them though, they're like, whenever the transaction goes through, pay it. This is my cost of how I choose to live my life. And by you trying to tell me that that's wrong, you're judging my life, how I choose to live it. And that's a small group. But it's an example though of people acting in a rational way to most bankers. But to that person, it's perfectly rational. And in those cases, those folks can actually afford it. If you look at their incomes, it's insane. But they're just not financially as disciplined as a banker might think everyone is. They're not. But I don't want a complete tangent around this. But the ability to leverage all the information to help people better manage themselves, there's something about how to deliver it and how them experiencing it needs to be almost gamified or something. some different way for them to consume and experience it that helps them. I wish I knew what that was, because the information.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think money is so emotional, and we're all so different about it. On a recent podcast, Mac, I was talking about, you can't even just prescribe one approach to managing finances to a large group of people, right? And I used even, my own example of, you look within my friend group, right? I can, within my own neighborhood of friends, I can give you, we have one couple who follows the FIRE system, the like financially independent, retire early, right? And I mean, the two of them will not spend a dime unless they absolutely have to, right? And so they are living epic levels of frugally because their goal is to retire early. And then I also have friends who just spend like it's going out of style, and it's like they don't care about the $5,000 in overdraft fees, right? It is what it is. I'll figure it out later. That's tomorrow's problem. And then, you look at my wife and I would like to say we probably fall into an in-between category of, we used to be a lot more conservative with our money and stuff. And then a few years ago, my wife battled breast cancer. And so that was a huge trigger for us of, hey, you know what? We could save every penny and get hit by a bus tomorrow. And so, what's the balance in there? And so, but if you were to go to even just those three groups and say, this is what I'm going to prescribe to all of you, it ain't going to work.
Nope.
Probably for any of us, but at the very least, it's going to only work for one. Yeah. Right? And so how do you make it intelligent enough to understand, hey, look, Mac's just one of those guys, man. He just really, really wants to party out on, the ocean, and he wants the latest surfboard, and he's cool with paying $5,000 a year in overdraft fees. So let's find a solution that helps him, that he's going to align to, versus, this other couple. That is a challenge, I think. And I think that's why, again, kind of going back to where you started this whole podcast, like, challenges are fun. Right? Like, they're a challenge for a reason. And so, trying to identify, hey, how can we actually leverage all of this data, all of this technology to have more meaningful impacts, I think is the point.
Yeah. Because people are trying to achieve whatever it is they choose to achieve. Right? Whatever it is, their goals in life. They're all very different. Yours, mine, we're all different. And I think that's awesome. But how do we help them do that? Because that's really what we're trying to do, right? And I think that is one of the things I think a lot about this. People think that these solutions are easy, but I mean, if you probably have built things, I mean, the getting the wrong answers quickly is one of the best tricks you can figure out, because you'll learn from each one of them. And, so that's my team here. I drive them insane sometimes because they see this idea I've got. And they go, oh, that's an incredible idea. And I go, that's version 70. Because my first idea was wrong, and my second idea was even worse, and then I figured out this, and now that's wrong. But that we need to figure out, it's okay. And this is one of the things I do struggle with a lot. People have a fear of failure that just freaks me out. I fail every day on something, I'm sure of it. But I don't worry about it. I just keep going. And it's one of the things in entrepreneurial space that is probably my degree. I had it all along just because of what I did in banks. But when I became an entrepreneur, I got much more comfortable at trying. Banks were a lot about risk management, right? And probability of failure, all this stuff. But when you're trying to build technologies and solutions and experiences and new ways of doing things, those failures are invaluable. You just need to know how to pull the, understand when it's done and when to change, going that direction, go this direction quickly. Fail fast. But I think that's probably one of the things I wish in bank culturally they would kind of pick up on that, because it's, it's like when banks try to build their own fintech companies by bankers that have always been bankers, and they wonder why it doesn't work. And it's because you guys are taking the very low risk approach. I'm taking an approach where I know a lot of these things I'm going to try to build are going to fail massively. But if I don't try to fail massively, I'm never going to get something that's going to be radically different.
Yeah.
And it's just more of an approach. It's not right. I mean, depends on what you're optimizing for, right?
Yeah. It's just, it is. It's different. It's different businesses, it's different approaches. I had Brian from True Stage Ventures on the podcast a while ago, and he was talking about a very real example of just, a lot of times when financial institutions, as a part of the due diligence process, evaluate a fintech's books. And they're like, oh my gosh, they burn $1 million a month. This is not a stable business. And it's like, well, no, our books are very different than your books. I'm burning $1 million in cash in, R&D for innovation because I'm going to create the next widget that's going to sell for $2 billion. I'm going to make all that money back and then some. But yeah, I'm going to burn $1 million in cash a month until I get there. And it's very different business models. And that, Mac, you actually brought me back to something I wanted to go back to that you were talking about earlier of when you were talking about just financial institutions, deciding if they want to build their own large language model, for example, or something. And it is really important to look at what your strengths are, right? And this goes back to the use case example. And if you are a financial institution trying to build the tool versus having somebody that's really good at building tools and then you being really good at understanding. And this is where I think there is a lot of opportunity that has not been seized is you're the experts in banking. So yeah, you should know like what is important to my financial institution, my customers. Well, something like, hey, this account is about to churn, or this account is about to default, or this small business goes through very cyclical cycles, right? Maybe they're a pumpkin patch. And so they make a ton of money in October and the rest of the year, they're just trying to figure it out, man. And so, how can we help them in maybe influxing cash during the planting season so they can plant more pumpkin seeds and get more pumpkins in October, but we recognize their business, right? It's like, that better than I do as a technologist, but I'm supposed to know technology better than you. So I'm going to give you really great tools, but you have to know what are the questions that I need to ask so that I can identify the right use cases so that I make sure I have the right tool and that I'm using the tool in the right way. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. So, it's actually one of the things about fintech, so I'll just use it broadly, and technology providers for the financial services industry is if those two groups, them and the banks, credit unions, savings banks, everybody can get in a constructive conflict about what should the questions really be.
Yeah.
The banks are asking questions from their paradigm of understanding the world. The fintechs have these possibilities of things. And so they're trying to figure, they don't understand banks. But together, the bankers might learn from the technology people, you're asking the wrong questions. You really could be asking this question, which is really the root. And that synergy of thought, and it's just such an opportunity. Like I teach data analytics. So we look at data analytics. One of the things I tell them is usually the number one problem in data analytics is the question you're answering is a bad question. Someone has come up with a question in 30 seconds, and you're going to spend, your team, the bank's going to spend 100 man hours figuring out the answer to that question. In your process of getting the question, you're still going to have to probably answer because it probably came from an executive. Is it a good question, or is there a better question that really gets to what this thing's talking about? And it's hard because that's not how we flow in this way. But if you have data analysts that understand the business really well, a simple example is credit union. Credit union was talking about their deposit, this goes on technical, point of sale debit card activation rate. Only 50% of our members have a active point of sale debit card. We need to go after this. Okay, one step back. It happens to be that if you have the operating relationship for that member, 99% of your members have an active point of sale debit card. Your real problem isn't the point of sale active debit card, it's the fact that 50% of your members don't have an active operating account. So if you try to solve the one, you won't have an active debit card without an active operating account because they're doing their checking somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so, but they had built out and they were chasing down this path as a strategy because there was a lot of revenue associated with it. And in customer experience, all kinds of good things. But the real problem was actually something different.
Yeah, that's a good point. I love the kind of concept of the 5 whys, right? Like when somebody, says, I don't know, maybe I can make one up on the spot. We'll find out how fast my brain works. But if somebody says, I need $100 and you ask why, and they tell you, right? Well, because I need to, buy some food. And you're like, okay, well, but Like, why? Why do you need to buy some food? Like, you have a stable job. You go down all of this, you may discover that the root of the problem is, they have a sick family member or something, and actually just helping to step in and, help support the sick family member or something may actually have a bigger impact than just giving them $100. I don't know. It's probably a ridiculous example, but like a lot of times you start with, sometimes we get so latched onto the thing that's right in front of us and we don't drill down deep enough to understand, well, like, why? And so I love that really simple concept of, we try to even use that in just product management, right? When a customer asks for a feature, you say, well, why? Like, why? I need a feature that does this. We're like, well, why? And they're like, well, because of this. And I love your example, right? It's like, well, if we had drilled down and been like, we need a feature to push, debit cards to everybody. If we build this feature, they get the debit card, but they don't use it. Why? Well, because they don't actually have, a strong relationship with you. So we solved the wrong problem, right? So how do you identify, like, how deep do you need to go to identify what's the actual problem you need to solve? I think that's a part of that whole, when you talk about having like an AI strategy, what problem are you trying to solve? And then have you dug deep enough to actually identify, are you solving the right problem? Or are you just looking at AI as the Band-Aid to everything because it's the thing that's the talk of the town?
Yeah. And how are people going to interact with all of this? The people aspect of technology is usually one of the laggards. It's unfortunate.
Why do you think that is?
So many examples of that. It's probably a different podcast.
Yeah. Well, no, I like that. So why do you think that is? And what are some of main?
So I worked at a very large, this is an old example, but it was during the mortgage boom of early 2000s. They spent a fortune building a piece of software that would, this is going to sound funny now, but at the time it was pretty miraculous, was going to be able to underwrite and approve a mortgage loan. At the time it took someone to go get a cup of coffee and come back. He called it a cup of coffee. They rolled it out, very big bank, rolled it out to lots of banks, lots of all their branches. And this is for the work in the branches. Technology-wise, it was pretty awesome. No one asked that the people in the branches understood mortgages. Turns out most of the people who worked in the branches, not the branch managers, but the personal bankers or whatever you call them, they didn't understand mortgage. They didn't know what points were. They didn't understand. They didn't own houses. They had no understanding of our mortgage process, yet they were going to be put on point to do all of this through this new software. There wasn't even a consideration. So they roll it out during pilot mode. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Not going well. Get on a plane, fly to the pilot market, go to the branch, sit there for the morning, ironically, and they understand it instantaneously. They had done no training. The people trying to use this had no understanding of what the folks back at central headquarters couldn't understand that someone that worked in a bank would understand a mortgage. Mm-hmm. But the reality of it was most people that were personal bankers didn't own their own homes, never been through a mortgage process, didn't have any experience with it whatsoever.
Okay, I love this. I'm gonna take a crazy bunny trail, but this segues to one of the things that we wanted to talk about too. I think that, so just coming back to something, and then we'll go to my bunny trail, is again, it's if you sit in around a room of bankers and then sit around a room of just non-banker people, they don't think the same about finances, right? Like maybe we do about baseball and hot dogs, I don't know, but not about banking and finance. We think very differently. And you see some very, very stark, obvious examples of that. And then there's some really, minuscule ones that, can have a big impact, but they don't necessarily bubble to the surface. And one of the, I think, really big examples of that, and just one of the reasons why you and I wanted to talk about it is this is definitely coming up more in the smaller community financial institution space, is servicing commercial business, right? Yeah. And the small to medium business market. And I was telling Mac that this has started to come up a lot more for us in conversations over the last handful of years of even smaller credit unions. Community banks, it's less because that's usually been more of their focus, but even in the credit union space, like smaller credit unions are saying, hey, we want to have a strategy around commercial. We want to offer commercial digital banking and all of this. And, even sometimes within the institution, we have very little understanding of what the expectations of services and digital services for an SMB may be in banking. But I tell you what, like, you start to look at the real world examples of that. And, one of my colleagues and really good friends gave me a great example of this. And he was talking about a personal friend of his. And he was like, I have a personal friend who's a remodeling contractor. And so he's a small business. He has a handful of employees, right? And so he has banking needs. He has to, input money from his customers. He has to do disbursements to vendors, to contractors that he hires out to. He has to pay employees, right? So he has a reasonably complex business banking relationship. And so, Jimmy was talking to me about him. He's like, look, dude doesn't even have an office, right? Like, he's in his F-350 with his laptop up on the center console, like plugged into the power outlet. And like, that's his office while he's on a job site. And so he's trying to do his banking. And he's like, and then all of a sudden you're presenting to him and you're like, hey, we're going to do money movement for you. And here's all the different transfer codes.
Yeah.
And like, you even talk to some staff at a bank and they have no idea what all these different, like, is it CTX? Is it like, they're like, I don't know. But I tell you what, that contractor has no clue and he couldn't care less, right? He's like, man, I'm just trying to remodel this kitchen and get paid.
Right. Of the things they think about in a given day,
Yeah.
as long as everything's working, banking's not in the top 100.
Yeah. That's probably true, huh?
Yeah. As long as everything's working.
As long as everything's working. Yep.
Different story. Because they don't think of payroll as banking or paying their vendors as banking. It's just paying their vendors. Banking just happens to be the tool they're using to do it.
Yeah.
It is. I will say this: that for people getting into commercial, like not just small business, but larger small businesses, business banking kind of things, commercial, established businesses. I would start learning and talking to customers about understanding from their perspective what it is. Because if you show up in front of a customer and you don't understand their business, you're not going to get their business. And it's a human capital investment you're going to need to make. A lot of credit unions are getting into it are hiring bankers, commercial bankers from banks. That is what they're doing. But the rest of the organization really needs to understand them. They have different needs. They think differently. Consumer relationships, we can understand that on some level because we're all consumer. On some level. But if you've never had your own business, it is a wildly different experience than, this is someone that never worked for themselves and then decided to start a company. That was a wild learning experience for a while. Because, I like those things that deposited every 2 weeks. Those were awesome. And if you're your own business, you got to figure out how to bring in everything you just described. Bring in the money, pay all the vendors, do whatever you need to do, and then disperse out you're in the middle of all that. It's just definitely a different way of thinking about it.
Oh yeah, that's funny. I mean, even just using you as the example, because we weren't even talking about this, but you made the comment when we were talking earlier about, you were like, I went from working in a bank to all of a sudden like founding a company, and like we went a month without even having a business plan, and then all of a sudden we're like having to do this. We've got employees. And now all of a sudden I know more about, insurance benefits than anyone needs to know. But, and keep me honest here, Mac, but like you're going into it and you're like, I'm just a technologist. I'm trying to solve technology problems. And so I'm really good at that. So I got that. And then you're like,
know what I didn't know.
I also now have to be an expert in payroll and benefits and in HR and in policies about time off. And
what do you mean there's a match to FICO?
All of this stuff.
Because I was used to paying FICO. I kind of did accounting, but the employer pays a match to that, and you're like, holy crap. So, anywho, but but if you're going to get into commercial, start understanding how commercial people think, or business clients think. It's different. It's not right or wrong. It's just a different experience. And they will really appreciate it if you seek to understand them. People love talking about their business is the other thing. If people are getting into, if you're a credit union getting into this, ask your new clients about them. They love talking about their business. It's their life. So probably on a final note on that, but yeah.
No, I mean, it's funny, Mac. I was just on a whirlwind travel tour this week through a bunch of different cities, and just kind of sitting in my Uber, like going from meeting to airport and things like that. And you look around at just the number of small businesses in little strip malls and just all these things. And I don't know why, but it literally, this trip kind of just struck me. And I'm looking at these, there's so many of these niche little businesses. And I'm like, man, who shops at these? Like who patrons these and keeps these places afloat? Like, and it's the community, right? It's the people around, and that business popped up because there was a need for that good service, product, whatever, in that community. And so it's important to that community. But again, I'm trying to think. There was one literally last night. It was like so late, and my poor brain just can't recall it. I can't remember what it was, but I was like, wait, there's really a store for that? I was like, I never would have guessed. I was like, that's crazy. But you have to imagine the person that started that is just an expert in that, or knows that really well, or did that and like had a community of people enough around them that they saw the opportunity to start a business around that. It's probably their life. I don't remember. I wish I could remember what it was, but it was such an off the wall thing that I was like, I would be absolutely mind blown if this place is like bankrolling. Like they're probably just barely keeping the lights on every day. This is probably a family that's there 24/7 just to keep the lights on and keep food on the table for the family, right? And so to your point, like banking and understanding that's the absolute last thing on their mind. They just want to get paid and make the payments they need to make and keep their business afloat and keep cash flow managed.
Yep, that's it.
Right. So I think there's a really big opportunity for the community FI space to support them a little bit better with tools that are thought about like what you were saying, like them, not like us, not like bankers, not like technologists, right? But just real people. Like if, Jimmy is sitting in his truck trying to do a quote for a bathroom remodel and he needs to do some banking. Like we got to think like him in that moment, not like bankers. So we need to think more like people. And I think, again, this is why I really love having folks like you as guests on the podcast, Mac, because you started this whole thing with like, I want to solve problems for real people. And to solve problems for real people, you need to think like real people. So I think that's a cool opportunity for this industry.
It is. It's awesome.
Well, hey, look, before I let you go, I have two final questions for you, sir. So where do you go to stay up to date on what's happening in our industry?
I use a lot of the association materials, so we're members of various, and I use a lot of that. I like Banking Dive. There's a couple. I read a lot of publications. I know that's not very exciting, but I do. I just read constantly almost everything that's published, and it's just a large variety. I don't have a particular one in mind. I also like looking at European writing on U.S. banking. They write about U.S. banking in a really different way than we do ourselves. It's kind of interesting. They put out things I never would think about. The economists to go at it.
Well, do you have any resources you go to for that?
The Economist is probably one I use a decent amount. I also do a lot of stuff that, like the Federal Reserve Fed at St. Louis Fed, data-wise. I get into a lot of the data. I don't know if anyone does that, but I do because I'm kind of a quant person that likes that. But I just talk to people constantly.
Yeah.
And I learn from everybody. Some things to do, some things not to do. But everybody's got things to learn from. So it's awesome.
Well, if people want to talk to you and learn more from you or share with you, how can they connect with you and how can they learn more about
they can reach out to Mac at White Clay if they like. We don't do initial hard sales. I like starting with conversations because we build relationships with our customers. I like having that. I just think that's just a better approach. So some people think it might be a better, different way, but I just like, so if anybody wants to talk about the topic or talk to us about how something works, or just talk to me about, I love banking, love talking about it. So just email me, Mac, M-A-C, at whiteclay.com. Or you can reach out to our website too. You can go through that to get a hold of us as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, sir. Thank you for just kind of your energy and enthusiasm, and thanks for coming and being a guest on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Josh. It's been awesome. I think we had a great free-ranging conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast powered by Typhon. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.